The documentary Nurangi seeks to shed an impartial light on the trade of dog meat here in Korea, which is indeed a dying industry, but one that still lingers on as tangible public interest and broader constructive dialogue remain lacking. Welcome to Issues and Insiders. The art of effecting change begins with the awareness in hopes that that awareness will lead to action. That being said, today I have the pleasure of speaking with director Kevinbraight of the documentary Nurangi that's hoping to reignite debate here over dog meat. Director Bright, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Sunny.
Right, so your documentary had its first theatrical screening here in Korea this past weekend. What are your thoughts?
Well, it was just amazing after waiting so long to finally, with the pandemic and everything, have the opportunity to come to Korea, show my film, and have some spirited conversation on the topic of dog meat.
Right. Director Bright, the day prior to the screening of your documentary was Jungbok here in Korea. According to lunar calendar, that's one of the 3 days of the summer, very special days where we are asked or called upon to consume healthy meals. Now, for most people, that would be chicken soup, and for a very few others, it's also dog soup, especially in the past, to fight, of course, the sweltering heat. Was the timing of your theatrical screening deliberately planned to fall around this day?
Well, it would be hard to hide that, yes, it was deliberately planned around this time, because this is the time where there tends to be a lot of conversation about dog meat and its future. So I thought it was the perfect time to finally show my film and to fuel that conversation.
Prior to the screening here, though, your film was available on YouTube, free of charge. This
Sure.
was back in the year 2021, was it?
Correct.
I see. Dr. Bright, do walk us through your journey through making this very poignant, if I may, documentary on dog meat.
Well, the first time I came to Korea, my wife is with an organization called Dove Project, and I was very curious about the dog meat culture in Korea. And when I made my first trip, what I found was there was a lot of confusion about the dog meat industry. Was it legal or illegal? How many dog farms are there in Korea? Is this something there's a lot of or just a small amount? So I felt like there was a good story here. There was also sort of a culture war going on about dog meat, people who, activists who were really against it. So I wanted to try to make a film that was unbiased but would get all the facts out there so the people of Korea can decide about the future of dog meat.
And this was a process that took you, how long was it?
Well, it took me 6 years total to make the film with editing, but 4 years of filming inside of Korea.
I see. I understand you also funded the film yourself.
Yes, I did.
It was very difficult finding investors, I suppose.
To say the least, it was not a good pitch to go to Netflix and say, I want to make a film about the dog meat industry.
Right. Director Bright, what were some of the moments that remain most in your mind amid the process of making this documentary?
Well, I think, first of all, I've been to many farms inside the United States, and going to a dog farm for the first time was a totally different experience. It was a smaller dog farm, and the owner was very poor, but it's kind of an assault on your senses the first time you go. Not just the smell, but the sounds of the dogs, so many dogs barking at the same time. But what I had never seen on a farm before was the poor condition of the animals. And these animals eventually are going to be eaten by somebody, and the two just didn't seem to be connected. And it made me aware of how this unregulated industry just sort of operates between the laws here in Korea.
You not only met with the farmers who run these dog farms, but also with, of course, industry insiders like the Dogmeat Association, I understand. Do correct me if I'm wrong, but Director Bright, I understand you also had to try dog meat to try to better understand the culture behind it. Is that right?
Yes, I really felt that, one of the things that I kept hearing was, oh, how delicious dog meat was, better than any meat in the world. And so that was one of the things that, I felt I needed to experience on my own. And yes, I tried it. And my opinion, because I think people would want to know that, is I did not find it to be appealing to my palate, but then again, I have a Western palate, so but yes, I did try it.
I understand those in the industry were trying to put to you a difference between dogs for meat and dogs for pet. There was an opinion you shared regarding that stance on the media. Could you tell us your thoughts again?
Yes. I think dog meat is really associated with poor times in Korea. Post-Japanese colonialism, post-Korean War, when Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world, there was no real source of farming protein and food. And so, things have really changed in Korea. I think in the last 20 years, the pet industry has taken hold here, and Koreans are now bringing dogs into their homes and realizing from that experience that there's no difference between pet dogs and meat dogs. All dogs are the same. And I think it's really changing hearts and minds here in Korea.
Right. Dr. Bright, how did you manage to keep a neutral stance while making your documentary? I understand you've put great emphasis on how your documentary is not one to condemn, nor of course to praise the industry, but you sought very hard to make sure that your film would not seek to direct the audience's thoughts or sentiments. Mm-hmm. How did you manage to do that?
Well, it took a while. I edited 22 different versions of this film because I really wanted to focus on getting it right, to be respectful to all of the participants, the Korean participants in the film, and to really focus on presenting the facts as I found them, not to be prejudiced in them in any way, but I made this film for the Korean people. It's really up to the Korean people to decide about dog meat, and that's why I only released the film here in Korea and in the United States, which is a very substantial Korean population. And I want to say this is also for the 7 million Koreans who live outside of Korea around the world.
Director Bright, were there any changes in your own thoughts with regard to the trade following your encounters with industry, insiders, pundits, consumers, as well as, of course, dog meat critics here in the country?
Well, I think, when I first came here, I sort of had it in the back of my mind, boy, I just wish they'd stop eating dog meat, that the industry would end. But once I got into it, I realized that it's a very complex issue. And it's complex because there are probably, a few million dogs in the pipeline right now. So if dog meat was to end tomorrow, what's going to happen to all those dogs? Also, the majority of farmers that are involved in dog meat are not making hand over fist money. They are very poor, and they were raised in a dog meat culture where they know nothing else. So those farmers are going to need assistance if we want them to change their lifestyle and do something different other than dog meat.
Director Bright, for those who have yet to watch your documentary, of course, how do you respond to remarks about the importance of respecting culinary practices and cuisines?
Well, I respect all traditions and cultures, but I think we all know that sometimes traditions have to change with the times. And I think that universally now, dogs are considered pets. They're considered companions. They're considered animals that protect us, that work for us, and are no longer looked at as food. And I think, that is, the change I really like to see here in Korea and about how dogs are looked at.
I understand you also made two additions to your family, furry friends called Hope and Oscar, while you were here at farms in the country. Could you tell us about your first encounter with them? Yes.
So Hope came from a shelter, and she was one of 6 puppies, the only female. And we picked her because she seemed to be the least afraid of humans at the time. You can imagine coming straight from the farm that the animals are still traumatized. But we named her Hope because we hope that she is the hope for meat dogs in the future. And then our other dog, Oscar, we just were driving by a house and we saw this poor little puppy freezing outside. It was in the middle of winter. And so we rescued Oscar. And we brought them home on the plane, and 6 years later, they're doing great, and they're really terrific pets, very appreciative of the life that we've been able to give them.
Right. Director Bright, efforts to eliminate the trade and consumption of dog meat here in the country have been evident across the aisle, of course, with lawmakers from both sides of the party trying to put this, add more momentum, that is, to efforts here. What more do you perhaps believe could be done to further fuel this debate or efforts to end the trade?
Well, I think the biggest thing is the loopholes have to be closed in terms of first of all, having dogs on a livestock list. I think that's the #1 biggest change that needs to be made, is taking dogs off of that list. But I think also that the whole idea of it's not legal, it's not illegal, it's kind of this gray area. Everything that happens in between, from the dog getting to a restaurant, is kind of very gray. And I think there needs to be some clarity about the status of dogs being shipped to a restaurant to be consumed.
Quite a number of us here in Korea, especially the younger generation, claim that, but most of us do not eat dog meat anyways. Was this something you came across when you were doing your interviews with the locals here in the country?
Did I come across dog meat while I was talking to the locals?
Exactly, the interviews that you had?
Yes. My wife, Claudia, her partner, Tammy Zussman, is a Korean American.
And she, I believe, is the protagonist of your documentary.
Yes, that's right. She's the protagonist of the documentary. And it really all started with her finding somebody telling her that she saw a video on YouTube that Koreans were still eating dog meat, and she said, "No, that's done. Well, they don't do that anymore." And she saw the video, and that's what started the journey on this film. And that's when I first found out about dog meat and how many dogs were being slaughtered annually and how many farms there were in Korea, and that it was a pretty big business.
And how many dogs are being slaughtered annually? Is 2 million the correct number?
Yes. I think, during the pandemic, it's gone down substantially, and that's more good news. Is you might have thought it might go the other way, but no. Dog meat consumption is down, the business is down, and I think that's just another sign that things are changing.
And would you agree that the younger generation is less inclined to have dog meat, given your interviews here?
Definitely the younger generation is not interested in dog meat, but the downside of that is I also found many of the younger people I spoke to be ambivalent about it, that they didn't have a position about it one way or the other. And I think my film would help that situation, because that's a byproduct of not having enough education about dog meat. It's just something they've heard about. They really don't know much about it. And I think finding out about it will change their minds.
Right, so essentially awareness about the situation could perhaps trigger more action from the young generation of the greater public here in the country.
I certainly hope so.
Right. Simply speaking, Director Bright, what do you seek to share through your documentary, Nurangi? And before we even talk about that, could you tell us a bit about the title that you chose, Nurangi?
Well, Nurangi is, as I said, I made this film for Koreans, and Nurangi is a very familiar term to Koreans, and it has multiple meanings. Everything from yellow dog, kind of a common dog, to the lowest form of animal. And so it kind of summarized the change I was looking to make to bring Nurangi from the lowest to the highest. The national dog of Korea is a Jindo. And if you look at a Nurangi and a Jindo side by side, you can see how they're very much related. So it's time for the Nurangi to take its proper place alongside the Jindo.
And that being said, what message do you believe or do you hope to share with your documentary?
I just hope to share the message that it's time for Koreans to decide about the issue of dog meat, and that only Koreans can decide. And that's really the message of it. And also, hopefully, to people who are not familiar with dog meat, it gives a better understanding of the situation in Korea, more empathy, and realizing we all have traditions that maybe it's time to change, and to not be prejudicial against the Korean people for.
And was there a scene, perhaps, Director Bright, that comes to mind when you think about the dog meat industry here, having covered it?
I think the scene towards the end of the film, when the dog meat farmer decides to close his farm, and he looks at the camera and he says he didn't want to try to hurt anybody. He really wasn't. And that really stayed in my heart and gave my heart to the farmers in a certain way to try to help them out of their situation.
Right, which is why you spoke earlier about the need to come up with measures to protect all the farmers as well as the dogs, of course, themselves. Director Bright, we fortunately have some time left to touch upon some of your other screen works, which I am personally very happy about. It feels surreal talking to you here because I watched quite a number of your shows when I was younger. I'm talking about your sitcom Friends, which continues to be a favorite of many here in the country, including my daughter who's going off to college, of course. How do you explain the global appeal of the sitcom Friends?
Well, I think you just summarized it in a certain way by saying your daughter is going off to college, because it's really a universal story. It's about a time in your life you're either approaching to be in your 20s and going off for the first time, or you're in your 20s, or you're older and you're remembering back into your 20s and what those times were like. So I think it tells universal stories, and I think that's where the appeal is. You
had Friends, the reunion that was made 2 years ago, it was 2021, that's when it aired. What was that like?
It was very strange because we got together on the Warner Brothers lot to celebrate the show, but it was still during the pandemic. So we had a socially distanced audience, and on that day, I was only allowed to spend maybe 15 minutes with the cast. They were all isolated. There was a lot of attention. So on one hand, it was a celebration, and on the other hand, we were all very aware about the world we were living in, that this celebration was taking place. I'm sure. Dr. Bright, are there any other projects going down the road that you're planning on or that you're working on right now that you'd like to share? Yes, well, I've just started another documentary, and I'm going from Dogmeat to something a little bit lighter, and it's a documentary about the cross-cultural impact of The Wizard of Oz on the world for all these years. The book was written in the late 1800s. Andrew Lloyd Webber is making a new musical, The Wizard of Oz. And it's just interesting how this theme of leaving home to find something better someplace else is so universal. So I think that's what attracts me to this story.
And hopefully the dogs in the dog farms will leave those farms
Toto
and
too.
start.
Toto
exactly.
too.
Are you thinking of making a second documentary on dog meat once legislation is put forward to perhaps ease the trade, eliminate the trade?
I'll say it here. I have an idea for a sequel to Nurangi, and Netflix, if you're listening, it could be yours. I think what I would like to do is bring some Koreans from a sort of cross-section of Korean society to the United States to see what happened to those dogs. Over 1,000 dogs have been put in good homes in the US by Dove Project alone, and I think it would be very interesting to get the view of Koreans visiting these dogs in the United States and seeing what happens to them. And also telling the story. This film focused on the story of the dogs here in Korea. What happens when they arrive in the United States to when they get into a home, and some of the challenges in the adoption area.
Right, as these dogs are given a new leash on life then.
Literally.
All right, Director Bright, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts here with us today.
Thank you, Sunny.
Right, well, on that note, we end this edition of Issues and Insiders. Do join us again same time tomorrow. Thank you for being with us.